Ole Miss and Georgia, can the Rebs actually get into that college football playoffs discussion? Plus, who's got the hottest of seats in the SEC when it comes to that coaching carousel? We'll talk about that here on Up to the Second College Football, presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors. Enter for your chance to win a $10,000 Academy gift card plus SEC championship game tickets just by signing into the Academy app. The ultimate SEC football sweepstakes runs from October the 8th through November the 18th. No purchase is necessary. Odds depend on the entries received. It ends again on November the 18th. You can find the complete rules at academy.com/official-rules. All right, so Billy and Caroline going to be talking about all the big games in college football. Is LSU going to bounce back? Alabama, Kentucky, you name it, they'll get into it. Plus, I talked to Chad Withrow of Outkick.com. A lot of good stuff to get into with him. What's up with A&M? What's up with Ole Miss and their future? That and more right here on Up to the Second.
Need a new grill? Academy Sports and Outdoors is the destination for your outdoor cooking needs. With our free in-store assembly and pre-assembled grills and smokers, buy online at academy.com and pick up in-store. So keep those grilling plans at Academy Sports and Outdoors.
All right, our next guest is not shy about his opinions and his hot sports takes. He's one of the best out there, Chad Withrow, host of Hot Mic with Hutton and Withrow, 3 to 6 Eastern on Outkick.com. Chad, what's up, buddy?
Hey, David, always good to hang out with you, man. Looking forward to talking a little SEC today.
Hey, so we were talking before the interview started. I just kind of want to go down that track. We're going to get into several other scenarios in the SEC, but just for right now, this A&M season, I never thought this was a 10-win team. I thought they were probably 8-4, 9-3. Technically, they're still in the running for that. But the way they find ways to lose games is what really is so frustrating. And that's 2 seasons in a row. Last year they won 5, a lot of one-possession games. They're doing it again this year. Just what do you take away from what you've seen against really good talent, really good teams, I should say, but still ending up short?
Yeah, it's really frustrating because coming into the season, I'm kind of like you. I thought, 10 wins was really on the outside for A&M, but I did think this is a team that, with their talent, could play spoiler to a number of teams across the conference. And it just feels like with A&M, every time you get to a point where it feels like you know something about them, that you can say, okay, this is what they are, that changes the next week. There was a time where you thought, man, this front seven's really good. They're great against the run. They can get after the quarterback. That's what they are. And then that holds true for 2 or 3 weeks, and then maybe that falls apart a little bit. Then you think, okay, maybe you got something with the running game, and then that's an issue. Special teams have been inconsistent at times. So I think overall just the inconsistency has been the most troubling part of it. And look, it's getting over the hump. I mean, the great teams win close games. Bad teams can lose a bunch of close games. Mediocre teams can lose a bunch of close games. But what separates the mediocre from the good and the good from the great is the ability to win a one-score game. And that's something that A&M just has not been able to do the last couple of years under Jimbo Fisher. And I don't know what the answers are. I think there's a ton of questions and a ton of unanswered questions about this team and this program under Jimbo, but that's really the frustrating part for Aggie fans.
Maybe your answer is about to be Jimbo here, but considering the contract, I don't know. I really do not know. Who's got the hottest of seats in the SEC right now?
Well, I think there's 2 names at the top. It's Jimbo and it's Sam Pittman at Arkansas. I think the shine is off the apple for Sam Pittman at Arkansas. So although they just got a big road win in overtime against Florida this past week, so that's a nice bounce back for them. I think that the heat could turn up on Shane Beamer if things don't turn around here. And I'm not saying for this year, but I think his seat could be pretty warm next year if this is a team with Spencer Rattler that's well below 500 by the end of the year, which looks like it may end up being the case. With Jimbo Fisher, I mean, you guys know better than I on this. It's what is the financial risk in terms of what A&M people are willing to spend? We know they're willing to spend a lot with NIL. We know they're willing to spend a lot on hiring a coach. So I would reason to believe that if they think that Jimbo is not leading this program down the right path, that they're going to be willing to spend that buyout money to go find someone else also. So I'd put him on the hot seat as well. I still think odds are that he's back. If I had to name one coach that's not returning, I think it's Sam Pittman, and then I'd probably go Jimbo Fisher next. But I think it's a solid chance. Both programs are looking for new coaches this offseason.
You can make the argument, and by the way, I don't think it's a strong argument, but you can be like, look how close we were. If Connor Wigman is healthy and we'll get him back next year, 3rd year, like you can make that argument. The part that I struggle with it is, yeah, you can, but you've gotten 5 quarterbacks hurt over the last couple of years, right? Like, if people continuously get injured. So, and are you going to be able to keep anybody? And that's the big question in today's college football for any program, USC included out there on the West Coast.
It's really tough because guys are going to have options every year. It's so hard to project also in college football what any team's going to be next year. I know it's fun for fans to sit back. Like you said, Aggie fans may say, hey, we got this, and this coming back. Schedule looks like this. Okay, that's fine, but you can't take anything for granted. So you're going to look up at the next year and start to guess what your team and roster is going to look like. But we have no clue. I mean, deep down, I don't know if you get in this practice also, David. I don't look at the class of guys. I don't look what year they're in the program because it's so fluid.
Yeah.
I don't think, oh, well, this guy's going to be here 3 or 4 years and he's going to be a really good player by the end of it. It's really a year-to-year proposition across college football. And if you're not one of the hot teams, you're constantly trying to steal some juice one way or the other in recruiting. And that's tough to do when you're not one of the top 10 or 15 programs in America. And then the whole strategy about how you're going to go about it. What's your percentage going to be? High school recruiting versus transfer portal. How are you going to manage that? We've seen Ole Miss have success by going heavy transfer portal, but now reports are that maybe Lane Kiffin wants to dabble a little bit more with high school players. How are you going to approach JUCO? Questions for every coach out there in roster management and maintenance. And I think that's tough. It bit Shane Beamer this offseason at South Carolina with some high-profile guys leaving that program. So we're going to see more of them. The key is to have a good functional NIL program to be able to retain the guys you really want to keep and not lose too many of them, and then be able to lure, I think, a few of the top transfers that you need at certain positions. To me, that's the formula to mix in with, let's face it, top 10, top 15 recruiting classes out of high school. That's the only way that with really good coaching, that's the only way you're going to be relevant in the SEC moving forward. And I think coaches and programs know that.
Chad, look, I'd be a failure as a head coach, but I think if in this current world of college football, if I were a head coach, I'd be looking for proven, experienced players more than young players. And I know that sounds counterproductive of what you're supposed to do, but I've just seen, and maybe I'm using A&M as this litmus test that I shouldn't, but like experience matters in today's college football with so many young players playing.
Especially on the offensive and defensive line. It matters a lot. I think with the offensive line, that is the one spot that I look at and say, you've got to keep guys together for 4 or 5 years, right? It's not, you can plug and play, the occasional, John Campbell at Tennessee is a good example at left tackle. Transfers in from Miami as a veteran guy, and he's been great. They plug and play him there, and he's been fine all season. But it's got to be one guy. You really need to develop those positions within your program under your coaching and get guys some reps together to really have a dominant unit on either the offensive or defensive line. So I think that's key at those positions. But I'm with you. I think, the hard part, though, David, is bring in all the young talent, not play that talent a ton, and then convince that talent after the year that your program is where you need to be because you're being developed. And even when guys don't get a chance to see it a lot on the field because they're just playing special teams or whatever it may be, you then have to get into the sales business of pitching them again, re-recruiting them and saying, we believe in your ability. Here's what our roster looks like. Here's where you're going to have an opportunity at safety or at slot receiver or wherever it is next year. We really need you to be a part of this. And then probably NIL is going to be involved too, because you know that NIL is going to be coming for them on the other end of the transfer portal. So it's really tough to manage. Look, I look at college football right now, and while I love it, it's my favorite sport. I think the quality of the game is at a really high level. If I am a coach and I have a chance to go to the NFL and only deal with football and only deal with coaching my guys and have someone else handle everything else, I am jumping at that opportunity to get out of college football. So I think we're going to see a little bit more and more of that, of really good college coaches, if given the opportunity, are going to want to get to the NFL game.
Chad, I want to talk Ole Miss for a minute. They got a huge game with Georgia this weekend. And I look at what Ole Miss has been able to do 2 out of the last 3 years. They're living the life that A&M expected to be living with Jimbo Fisher. They expected to be, because they're probably going to be a 10-win team again, right? What kind of chance do you give them against Georgia this weekend, considering Georgia hasn't lost in forever? And Ole Miss, they don't seem that good, but they find ways to win games.
I don't think Ole Miss has a chance on the road. They're a different team away from Oxford, I think, than they are at home. So I give them a slim chance of winning this game. But it is incredible what Lane Kiffin's able to do. They're never overly relevant to start a season, but they just kind of hang around. There's a one-loss team that we haven't spent a ton of time talking about all year. Then I look up and I see, hey, it's only a 3-point spread at home. What's going on there with that spread? And then they eke out a win over A&M to stay once beaten on the season. And they just kind of hang around. It feels like they do that almost every year, even with not a ton of buzz going into the season. So Lane Kiffin's done a great job. We know he's a good offensive coach. He's learned along the way about how to become a more responsible and better head coach. And I think we've seen that over his time at Ole Miss. He still likes to rib people. He still likes to have fun during the games. I know that rubs a lot of people the wrong way, but that's who he is. He's never going to change that. And because of that, I think it's kind of led to the identity and personality of that Ole Miss program. I don't give them a great shot at winning this week. I actually think Missouri is probably a little bit better than Ole Miss. And Missouri hung tough with Georgia in that game. It's a 3-point game, I think, third or fourth quarter before Georgia pulled away. I think that's probably a 2-touchdown spread. And Georgia kind of keeps Ole Miss at arm's length most of the day.
Chad, how about LSU, when it's all said and done? How are we going to look at them these first couple years? Because obviously year one was fantastic. A little bits of blips on the radar towards the end. This year, had A&M taken care of business, they would have had the same conference record as LSU. But A&M loses. LSU loses one. How do you think they will be perceived at the end of this year?
Well, my question for them, first off, who's going to replace Jaden Daniels, right? That's going to be a big question mark. Offensively, they have no real questions. They've been great on offense all year. They got to find a defense. And there's no excuse not to have a really good defense at LSU. We've seen it since Nick Saban came to the SEC the first time at LSU. They've hung their hat with some dynamic defensive players that have gone on to have really good NFL careers. So Brian Kelly's got to figure that part out. I think if they figure out the defense, they're going to be right there at the top of I know we're going away from divisions, but they're going to be right there with the Alabamas, the Georgias, everyone else. They're not that far off right now. I just think defense is the big separation. Alabama's got a defense. Georgia's got a defense. That's who they're going to measure up to all the time. And right now, LSU just lacks in that department. Offense is great. It was number one in America coming into that Alabama game. It's a scoring offense, but they got to figure things out defensively. If they do that, they're recruiting well. You can live and be a very good team just recruiting the state of Louisiana and locking down that state for LSU. So if they continue to do that, I think they're going to be a really good program, only getting better. So I would be encouraged if I'm an LSU fan, but I don't know that I'm thrilled because you know what you're getting with Brian Kelly. You're going and hiring a mercenary head coach, much like the Jimbo Fisher hire at A&M, right? You're hiring a guy that has been there, that's competed for national championships at a big program. You're luring that person away from a big program to come in and help you win a national championship. There's no other way around it. That is the goal when they hired Brian Kelly.
Chad, great stuff, man. Thanks so much for making time. We'll do it again.
Hey, always fun. Thanks for having me on the show.
At Academy Sports and Outdoors, bikes for the whole family are just a click away. Buy online at academy.com with our free in-store assembly. Your next set of wheels, plus helmets, pads, and water bottles will be waiting for you at our in-store pickup counter. Get to the fun faster with our in-store pickup and free assembly at Academy Sports and Outdoors.
Coming up next, Billy and Caroline tackle that LSU defense. Can they figure it out by the end of the season? That and more.
Welcome in to Up to the Second, brought to you by our friends over at Academy. He is Billy Liucci. I am Caroline Fenton. And Billy, last week, we were talking about how both of our teams, Texas A&M and LSU, had big games, SEC West rivalry games, and now we're both down bad this week because we didn't get any good news from either of our teams.
Down bad, and I was thinking...
Down horrendous.
Yes, horrendous, particularly here in College Station. It's crazy, too. I was thinking about for all the LSU talk this year that's been generally positive, had A&M, pulled that off against Ole Miss, they're sitting there with the same record. But they're not. And A&M's a disappointing 5-4. LSU's a disappointing... Are they 5-3 or 6? They're 6-3 right now?
6-3. Mm-hmm.
A disappointing 6-3. Both are A&M in particular, but both are for all intents and purposes out of the SEC West race. I know that was both teams' goals this season. LSU in year 2 of a new coach with a likely Heisman finalist at the helm. It's a much more fun fall than A&M right now in year 6 under Jimbo Fisher, and a lot of uncertainty swirling around him and his future in Aggieland. We'll talk about that in a minute. But just the games. Look, it was a survive and advance Saturday for really 3 teams, and the one that fell by the wayside was LSU. And, if A&M had beaten Ole Miss, this race would probably be over by now, and Bama's checking their ticket to Atlanta. Ole Miss pulled it out. I guess let's start with the bigger game, though, the high-profile game, prime time, Alabama and Jalen Milroe with a statement Saturday for him. Man, what a far cry for Jalen Milroe than his last 2 marquee games at home, which were Texas, where he made some disastrous mistakes down the stretch.
Yeah.
And then Ole Miss, where it was kind of they slogged their way to 24 points, and they looked very vulnerable offensively, looked great on defense. Not the case against LSU on Saturday night, where Milroe turned it up, started running, and the rest was history, and they outlasted Daniels, a pretty gutsy effort by him and LSU. What were your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, credit in the world to Nick Saban, that coaching staff, and Jalen Milroe, because that team has only gotten better.
Yeah, they have.
Every week, I've learned something new about this team, and every week I find myself saying, wow, a game that I thought was going to be much more difficult for Alabama. They ended up winning it one way or another, whether it was easy or whether it was ugly or not. They found out a way to win it one way or another. I think the frustrating thing for me was that was such a winnable game for LSU that they had everything within their grasp. It was a tie game going into half. The offense was humming, but the same problem that's been a problem all season long continued to be a problem on Saturday night, and it was the defense.
Yeah.
And credit to some of the young guys, because LSU was starting 3 true freshmen in the secondary because of injury and because of disciplinary issues. They were starting 3 true freshmen in the secondary, and the passing game wasn't the problem.
No.
It was stopping the run. Jalen Milroe himself ran for 150 and 4 touchdowns. I don't understand it. It is inexplicable how you can have Mason Smith, a future first rounder, Harold Perkins, a future first rounder, and a whole lot of talent around them in that defensive line and linebacker room, and you can't limit Alabama from rushing for almost 300 yards. It is inexplicable, and it's unfair to Jaden Daniels.
You know how many yards? Well, and first of all, credit Milroe, because when I say this, there's a flip side of that coin. You know how many yards Alabama ran on A&M at Kyle Field for?
Less than 100?
23 net rushing yards. 23. Now, and I think even before sacks, they're gaining like in the 60s or maybe 70 yards. No, not even. They didn't lose 50 yards in sacks. It was, I think Bama ran for under 50 yards net. Before sacks, yards gained around 50, net yards like 23. Now, Milroe bombs away to Burton in that game. He threw for 300 plus. So look at this quarterback that we all doubted early in the year, and he throws for 300 at Kyle Field, and Bama escapes scoring 26. And then he gets in a shootout with a Heisman finalist at home a few weeks later, and he runs for 150 plus and 4 touchdowns. It's what I've been asking that guy to do since they played Texas. I wanted Milroe to take off and run more in that game because I thought Bama would win if he did that. Now he's doing that. He has had some success as a passer. He's still going to have his ups and downs. But Caroline, I think this is the best coaching job. If they finish the season 11-1, it might be the best coaching job Nick Saban's ever done. You got to give a lot of credit to Tommy Rees.
Yeah.
Very young, very green, stepping into a massive job there and coming from Notre Dame and just kind of figuring it out for this team and this offense as the season's gone on.
But look at where this Alabama team started. I mean, losing to Texas and Texas looking like the dominant team. Alabama getting bullied up on both lines of scrimmage. Close game against South Florida.
Yeah.
I mean, you're trailing at the half in 3 SEC games against A&M, against Ole Miss, and against Tennessee.
Yep.
You find
barely
ways
beat
to
Arkansas.
Barely beat Arkansas. You let Arkansas get back into the game with you. Tied at halftime in a shootout against LSU. And I said all last week, if this game gets into a shootout, LSU wins. Because I don't think that this Alabama offense is constructed to get into a shootout like that. They proved me wrong. Alabama continues to prove me wrong. So absolutely credit to Tommy Rees and to Nick Saban, this entire coaching staff. And I thought, look, I think Alabama's most clear path to victory is running the football. Because, Jalen Milroe can air it out 80 yards and take advantage of a young, inexperienced LSU secondary. But what good is it if you're Alabama to throw the ball 80 yards deep and score in less than a minute just to give the ball back to Jaden Daniels and that LSU offense? It's not. Run the clock out and run the football. But LSU wasn't willing to make those defensive adjustments. They weren't willing to spy Jalen Milroe and at least stop him from getting out of the pocket and making plays with his legs. So it's a tough one for LSU to swallow because you could have won it. You didn't because of what was on the table. SEC West Championship, Heisman Trophy for Jaden Daniels, potentially maybe a CFP bid. Now all of that is out the door.
Yeah.
And now Jaden Daniels' status against Florida this weekend is in question. It's a tough one to swallow for LSU.
Let me ask you this. Assuming, we'll talk about Florida before we move on from LSU. Assuming LSU beats Florida and beats A&M, particularly if Max Johnson's unable to go, that because A&M, I'm not writing them off again. Why would you? They were beating Bama at halftime, beating Tennessee at halftime, came down to the final play at Ole Miss, final minutes against both Bama and Tennessee. Why would you think that they couldn't go compete with an LSU team that didn't fare as well against Bama as A&M did, that did lose to Ole Miss just like A&M on the final play? Of course, different style of game, but let's just say they do, and they finish 9-3. Because I think we know if they go 8-4, we're going to call that a pretty disappointing season on the Bayou.
For sure.
If they go 9-3 and they're 6-2 in the SEC, and Jaden Daniels is a Heisman finalist, hell, he might win it, but let's say he's a finalist. Just keep it there.
Yeah.
Is that a successful year too for Brian Kelly, or do folks in Baton Rouge consider that a disappointment?
I'll answer that in 2 different ways. Will the folks in Baton Rouge think it's a disappointment? Yes. But I think the fair answer is, well, you were ahead of schedule in year one. That you basically had to pick up a bunch of broken pieces defensively and just tape it up with duct tape and just hope that it would work. And it did. They were successful. And you were able to beat Alabama in year one and kind of take advantage of an SEC West that was beating up on one another. That opened up a path for LSU to get to the SEC championship game. And look, last year wasn't pretty, but getting to the SEC championship game in year one, who wouldn't take that?
Anybody would.
I think LSU was a bit ahead of schedule. That if you would have told any LSU fan when Brian Kelly was hired that in year 2 you're going to be 9-3, I think anyone would take that.
Yeah.
But last year raised expectations, maybe fairly so, maybe unfairly so. I'd be fine with 9-3 as long as there is a hope to fix the areas that need fixing, but also with the underlying gray cloud of you're not going to have Jaden Daniels next year. You're not going to have Malik Neighbors or Brian Thomas next year. You might not have Logan Diggs next year. That if you continue to rework the defense, well, simultaneously next season, you're going to have to rework the offense as well.
I'll be interested to see, if Jaden Daniels can't go. I know people like Nuss. Garrett Nussmeier can sling it. He's got that gunslinger in him. He's a passer. He's got the weapons to throw it to. I still think, regardless of what happened in the second half of that Georgia game, I mean, the drop-off is massive from Daniels to Nussmeier. And you'd be going, now fortunately that one's in Baton Rouge, correct? You'd be going into that game, though, I think it would be dicier, right? Because your defense isn't going to carry you to a victory like historically LSU defenses can do.
Gosh, no.
If they lose that game, and LSU has finishes 8-4 or worse, but 8-4. Okay, if they lose that game and they finish 8-4, I think there's a flip side to the Brian Kelly coin where you're going to go, and it's a lot of people don't get this when it's coming from an Aggie because Lord knows you've got a ton of ammo to throw at me if you're like social media and want to come at me, for A&M's. But we're talking LSU here, and I'm trying to talk about it completely unbiased because it really is at this point. If LSU has 8 losses in 2 years, a lot of people say, well, he won the West in year 1. I know that would be. But if they lose 8 games in 2 years and have 4 losses each season under Kelly, I do think there would be some people in Baton Rouge that go, this better get a lot better. We'll see. I mean, again, I think they're gonna write. I think Jaden will probably. I don't know. That looked pretty. By way of concussion, that one look. I might be surprised if he's out there, but I think they can win at home. I think they can score enough with those weapons and Nuss. If they don't, interesting story. Probably right now a lot more interesting story in College Station, and being perfectly honest, a more interesting story in Oxford.
Yeah.
Talk about give me your take on what went down Saturday morning. Ole Miss 38, A&M 35. The Aggies and our guy Max Johnson with a pretty gutsy effort. Broken rib, 300 yards, 31 of 42. Gives the Aggies the lead with under 5 minutes left, and that defense they've leaned on so much this year couldn't get the stop. They get the ball back. A special teams. The special teams couldn't execute there at the finish line, and
Right.
Instead of overtime, Ole Miss with a walk-off victory. What were your takeaways from Oxford?
First of all, you can say whatever you want about Max Johnson. What you can't say is that he's not tough.
No.
That he's not going to put every single ounce of himself into the game on the field, and he's going to leave it on the field.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was ever in question, but I think Saturday was the perfect example of Max Johnson just being a team first guy and just being a football guy. It's tough because when it comes down to a missed field goal, and you look at all the other opportunities, because it's tough to put it on that. Because there were so many other things that led up to needing a field goal to potentially take it to overtime and keep your hopes for winning alive. Look, Ole Miss's offense is really good. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, I was on the receiving end of it just a few weeks ago when Ole Miss dropped 50 plus and over 700 yards on this LSU defense. I think that Jackson Dart was able to pick apart a Texas A&M secondary that, frankly, has struggled for a good bit of the season. It's majority of the reason why Texas A&M lost to Miami was because Tyler Van Dyke was able to pick apart that young secondary. Quinshon Judkins is really tough to stop. But what I don't get, Billy, and I want to get your thoughts on this, is I look at Texas A&M, how good that defensive front is. 30 TFLs in 2 back-to-back weeks against Auburn, and then who was the next week?
Auburn and Arkansas.
Auburn and Arkansas. And we know what they can do. We know there's talent.
I mean, they got after
You gave up
Milroe,
over
they got
100
after
rushing
Milton.
yards to Quinshon Judkins, and then you let Tennessee rush for over 200, 250 just a couple of weeks ago. That really is what it came down to me.
Yeah, me too. And look, Jackson Dart was the MVP. You look at his numbers, they only sacked him once. I thought he did a terrific job of getting rid of the football and not taking sacks under pressure. He's
another one who is tough as nails.
He is.
To give credit where credit is due.
Absolutely. He really is. He's not scared. I don't like the way he runs his mouth. It's, he's
a product of his coach.
He is. And it's you have every opportunity to do something about it. You have 60 minutes to do something about it, and Bama did something about it. And I think, other teams have not this year. So, I mean, he's a competitor. I respect the game. I respect the way he plays. He's tough. And he's throwing dimes, and when he's not, he's got Trey Harris making catches.
Mm-hmm.
Like a couple plays where Jackson Dart was off target or Trey Harris probably walks into the end zone. But an amazing game by that wide receiver who visited A&M, who was, a target out of the portal. Lane cries about losing recruits and portal and all this. They do a pretty good job in the portal, and I'm pretty sure those guys aren't playing there for free. Let's just put it that way. He cries a little more than he needs to, but it's all part of the delivery there, and it works for them. But Trey, Jackson, Quinshawn, Judkins going for 100, I don't think was terrible. I think, we're considering they ran for 390 at Kyle Field last year. Part of the problem, Caroline, and part of the issue is, I think DJ Durkin and his scheme versus that style. You look at Tennessee, you look at Ole Miss, you look at Ole Miss last year. I know there's an exception in there I'm not thinking of, but in reality, in 2 years under Durkin, those were probably the three teams that more than any cut up the A&M defense, carved them up on the ground, like specifically running the football. And I think that is a scheme versus scheme matchup type thing as much as anything else. You got these great D linemen out there. You spread them out. They want to stop the pass. You get them with 3 on the field instead of 4. You hurry up and you go tempo and you keep that personnel out there. You try to tire them out. I think it's a schematic thing. I think DJ Durkin's done an incredible job this year. But I think that's, when you look at games ahead of time and you go, this is a tough matchup. I said it before Tennessee, said it before Ole Miss. Both of them rang true. The key is to keep them behind the sticks. And all too often, Jackson Dart and Trey Harris were making plays early in downs, and then they were able to lean on that run. But I'll tell you this. When A&M, the truth is they're without 2 starting corners in that game. They were on their 3rd and 4th cornerbacks, and they had already moved Josh DeBerry to nickel. So really from where you were a couple weeks ago prior to Tennessee, you were on cornerback option number 4 and number 5, and those were your 2 starters.
Been there.
That is the LSU. Hello. That is the nightmare to play to play Ole Miss.
Yeah.
They actually were in position to make a lot more plays than they did, and credit Harris mainly for making play after play after play. And there's something to be said for turning around and finding the football and being just a step out of position where you're unable to do that. But that dude made some real plays and real coverage. That was just a tough luck, hard luck defensive game for A&M where Ole Miss and Dart, like you said, they were on. And at some point you give credit where it's due. They hit him. The ball goes fluttering up in the air like a helicopter on Ole Miss's final drive. And A&M gets called for PI. Freshman DB can't find the football because how could you when it goes 100 feet in the air? And he just tackles the receiver.
It's 1:30 in the afternoon.
Yeah, in a game that would be in a play that normally would be picked off, it's a 15-yard gain and a PI on a decisive drive. And it's not a tip ball because it hit – the tackle got pushed back into Dart. His hand hit the helmet and the ball flew up awkwardly. It was the right call.
That could be all the difference.
Yeah, if somebody sees that football awkwardly, that's intercepted, the game's over for all intents and purposes. It wasn't that kind of day for A&M. It hasn't been that kind of year for A&M, and it hasn't been, unfortunately, that kind of tenure for Jimbo Fisher. What's your feeling? Because I've talked mine into the ground, and I guess, we're sitting here with other fan bases watching this, including my friends up in Knoxville. So many of them came up and said they watched and appreciated the show. And I want to hear your take about Jimbo, because what I said to Mac and Cube this morning was this. I didn't pay any attention last year to the chatter, the smoke, what people hear that were, I don't know. I knew with 100% certainty that Jimbo Fisher was going to be back for 2023. I can't say the same thing for 2024, and this thing shifted dramatically Saturday. When Lane Kiffin goes on game day and he makes a big production of it all week, and you got all those guys yucking it up, like they pick their programs they like to make fun of, and they pick the programs where they'll just kiss the ass of whatever coach is there and whatever. A&M is not one of those that they pick. But when they're sitting there laughing and yucking it up and Lane's leading the charge, and then you go out there and can't beat them, and you lose for a lot of the same reasons. And these numbers, Caroline, 6-12 in your last 18 against Power 5, 10-11 in your last 21 games overall, 9 straight road losses, 0-3 versus Kiffin, 5 in a row to the Mississippi schools. The way that game happened, and in a vacuum, losing on the last play to the number 11 team in the country on the road, okay. But we're not in a vacuum. You're 5-4 right. After 5-7. It's year 6, and I think, man, if things go down between now and the end of the season, and Jimbo Fisher is replaced, it's you can circle that game, because imagine if they won. Imagine if they won Saturday. What's our conversation? It's completely different. Not in terms of
you get that road monkey off your back. You're able to beat a good contending team.
Yeah.
You're able to say, okay, look, it's been rough, but we got a big win.
Yeah.
We can at least now, the pressure alleviates a little bit.
You'd feel good about being 5-2. You get Mississippi State at home.
Yeah.
You go, hey, we're 5-2 in the SEC with our backup quarterback. All that's off the table now. And now you go back to, the pressure's rising from underneath here locally. Pressure's coming down from the outside. Recruits are seeing it. Your players are getting frustrated. They're fighting their butts off. They did it again. I mean, if there's one thing you say about Jimbo and this team, it ain't for lack of effort, and it sure as heck isn't that they've quit playing hard for the coach or they've quit coaching hard. They're just not winning, Caroline.
In the SEC, I feel like there's a very fine line between it's still early and it's too late.
Right.
With Brian Kelly and with LSU, I can couch a lot of these issues and problems that I have with the program by saying, look, it's still early.
Yeah.
And Brian Kelly inherited a team with 38 scholarship players 2 years ago. Like, there's still time.
Yeah.
With Sam Pittman, it's a little bit too late.
Yeah,
it's too late for you to not be beating BYU at home. It's a little bit too late for you, an offensive line guru, to have such offensive line problems, especially when your starting quarterback is a vested veteran in this league.
Yeah.
For Jimbo Fisher, it's too late.
Yeah.
Because you look at Josh Heupel, what he did at Tennessee. He's in year 3, and he's already gotten Tennessee to the number 1 spot in the country, the number 1 offense in the country. The fan base is finally excited, and Tennessee is relevant. Brian Kelly got LSU to the SEC championship game in year 1. And you look at so many coaches across college football early in their tenures that have had a good bit of success.
Yeah.
I mean, Sonny Dykes at TCU got his team to the national championship game in year 1. Look at what Dan Lanning is building at Oregon so early in his tenure. So I think that Texas A&M fans have every right to say, look, dude, it's year 6. We're recruiting at an incredibly high level. Texas A&M is consistently a top 5, top 3 recruiting class in the country. And look, I know I'm not going to star chase. I know that recruiting rankings and 5 stars, 4 stars, they're not everything, but there's something.
Yeah.
That when you're consistently bringing in talent like that, you need to be able to deliver. A 9 road game losing streak, it's not good enough. A 5-7 year in year 5, and you don't have much to show for it in year 6. It's not good enough. 1 year of being just outside of the top 4 of a college football playoff spot, it's simply not good enough. And what has Jimbo shown me to show me that, hey, things are going to get better in year 7 or year 8 when they haven't gotten better in year 4, 5, or 6?
Tell you what, it's fascinating if you go back and look, is I think things turned south badly for Kevin Sumlin in what year was it there? I'm losing track with this. In 2016, was it? Yeah, because he 17 was his last season. In 2016, and they had Trevor Knight, and it was they rolled up, they beat Tennessee here, and then Trevor got hurt, and A&M was number 4 in the playoff ranking, and they lost back-to-back games to an unranked Mississippi State that was a bad football team, and they lost to the next week to an unranked Ole Miss where they had to start Shea Patterson, who had never played. They pulled his red shirt in like game 10. Came into Kyle Field, Aggies were up like 21-6, dropped a touchdown that would have been 28-6, would have been over. Ole Miss wins that game, and things were really never the same for Sumlin and A&M. They went on to lose to LSU. They lost a bowl game. They started that next year with that loss at UCLA. Ole Miss. This year, you go back, and I would say 2 years ago, you mentioned that top 4 finish, an amazing season that in some ways Jimbo and A&M never got credit for because, it was, everybody wants to say, it's COVID, it's the outlier. Forget the fact that he just had a senior quarterback, a senior-laden team, a really good O-line, and a lot of veterans, and that was the reason why. You had a chance to capitalize. You had beaten Bama number 1. You had beaten Auburn number 11. You were rolling. You were number 10 or 11 in the country going into Oxford, and you let one get away to Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss, Matt Corral. And then a couple weeks later, you lost to a bad LSU team with Edo on the way out. It started 2 years ago, and A&M was at like a crossroads. And if you win those 2 games, that's back-to-back 10, 9-1 in the COVID year. Back-to-back New Year's 6 bowl games, they would have been anywhere from 20 and 21-3 to 20-4 in 2 years, however that bowl game went. And I think it rolls. They were signing the number 1 class of all time. I think it could have rolled. You lost in Oxford, that started it. You just have to wonder, Caroline, if a loss in Oxford finished it. I wouldn't call that likely, but I would certainly call that possible as we sit here today. So that's my take on the A&M thing. I guess let's roll that into the rest. Let's race around the SEC here and talk about this weekend because A&M Mississippi State, it's obviously massive for what's going on here locally. And there might be no Will Rogers, no Connor Wigman, and no Max Johnson, TBD. The Aggies would start Jalen Henderson, the Fresno State transfer, who was a backup there. He's been here as the 3rd string, then the 2nd string, and now potentially the starter this weekend. LSU. All right, are we talking about LSU this week? LSU and Florida. We talked about it. Do you think Florida gives them, before we move on to the Georgias and Tennessees of the world, do you think Florida tests LSU, or are you feeling pretty confident in this one in Death Valley?
I can't feel confident about any game on LSU's schedule as long as their defense is as bad as it is, and I don't think that defense is changing anytime soon. Graham Mertz has shown us that he can sling the rock around now. Like, he's not a great or elite quarterback in this league, nothing of the sort. But he's shown us that he can take advantage of bad defenses. He threw for over 400 yards against South Carolina. They've got a 1-2 punch at running back, Montreal Johnson and Travis Etienne, that can run the heck out of the football. We just saw LSU's run defense this past week against Alabama. And look, I don't know if Jaden Daniels is going to be able to go. If he is, I feel better. If he's not, I'm a little bit concerned, but you still feel pretty good about Garrett Nussmeier and how he's able to throw the football. This is a game that LSU should win. This is a Florida team that's struggling. This is a Florida team that just lost to an Arkansas team that just fired their offensive coordinator. This is a Florida team that might not win a bowl game. And it's in Death Valley, which I think is credit to LSU and better for LSU in their circumstances. It all kind of depends on Jaden Daniels. But even if it's Jaden Daniels, if it's Garrett Nussmeier, whoever it is, they're going to have to put up a lot of points. That's just the reality of this LSU team. But I'm interested in your thoughts since you just saw them on full display. Ole Miss, Georgia. Does Ole Miss have a chance to shock the college football world this weekend?
They have a chance because teams have played Georgia tough this year. At least a couple of them. South Carolina did. They're not a good team. Missouri certainly did this past weekend. Auburn did. They're not a good team. So from that standpoint, I'd say, look, 3 teams Georgia's played this year have, and if I'm forgetting one, correct me, but 3 teams they've played this year have played them very tough.
Auburn, Missouri.
And not Kentucky. Not Florida.
Kentucky.
Not Kentucky, not Florida. It was Auburn, Missouri. And here last week, I said it a minute ago, and now you've got me. South Carolina. They were up 14-3 at halftime.
Yes, yeah.
But with that said, I think I said it's all about matchups. I don't think Ole Miss matches up great with Georgia, and I think Georgia has been pretty damn stout at home, and I think Ole Miss is a team that benefits a great deal when they're playing at home versus on the road. Look, I like the Ole Miss offense. I love it, but I still don't think it's what it has been. I don't think their O-line's great. I think what they did against A&M, it was a matchup. It was a battle of matchups, and I think it was a matchup that was favorable to Ole Miss in terms of scheme and style of play versus A&M. But I also think, look, they were throwing balls against two corners that had combined to play, I don't know what the number is, but maybe 50 snaps of college football. And they're not going to have that same luxury in Athens this weekend.
I just look at Ole Miss's schedule so far, and the games that they have won: LSU, Arkansas, Auburn, Vanderbilt, Texas A&M. What all of those teams have in common is that the secondaries are average to bad to really bad.
True.
Georgia is an elite secondary. I would say the second best secondary in the SEC is probably Alabama.
And what happened when they played that one?
That Ole Miss has on their schedule. Ole Miss was only able to muster up 10 points.
Yeah.
Now, I said the same thing about Missouri because Missouri hadn't faced very stout secondaries either. And it really wasn't Brady Cook that was carving him up with his arm. It was really the run game.
Yeah.
But I think this Ole Miss offense is just as balanced as a Missouri offense. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Ole Miss put up a fight. I just think this Georgia team's too complete. This Georgia team is just far too talented. And in Athens, I don't see Ole Miss being able to pull it off here. I don't think they're quite there yet, nor do I think that Ole Miss has shown us that they can consistently recruit at a level like a Georgia and an Alabama.
Does Tennessee set up the showdown with Georgia in Knoxville by holding serve this weekend against a Missouri team that's probably licking its wounds? But I feel like that's a tough game for the Vols.
Yeah.
Away from Rocky Top. Going out there to Columbia and taking on Mizzou.
I feel better about Tennessee's chances now than maybe I did a few weeks ago. And part of that is they were able to prove to us that they can win games away from Neyland Stadium, which is something that they've struggled to do all season long when they beat Kentucky at Kroger Field.
True.
And Joe Milton's been playing better ever since that game against Texas A&M when he had, just over 100 passing yards. Both teams' passing games as a whole just really struggled. The first half against Alabama, Tennessee's offense looked really good. Joe Milton looked really good. Against Kentucky, I thought Joe Milton looked really good. So I think that Joe Milton gives them a better chance now than maybe I would have believed in him a few weeks ago.
Good point.
But they made that Tennessee secondary made Devin Leary and that Kentucky passing game look better than they have all season long. Now, is that Kentucky's offense just figuring things out? Is that Tennessee's defense maybe helping them out a little bit? Truth is probably somewhere in the middle. But this is a Missouri passing attack that can kill you. And Luther Burden is questionable.
Yeah.
So I think that's a huge factor if he can or he can't go.
In this game, yeah.
Advantage to Tennessee in their defense if Luther Burden isn't able to go. But Columbia is a sneaky, difficult place to play. But I think this year is different because the difference this season is that nobody's overlooking Missouri. And if you're overlooking Missouri, that's on you.
Yeah. Ultimately,
I can't help you there.
I think I'll go with Tennessee in this one because I think ultimately they win the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball. I like that volunteer running game to support Milton, and I like their defensive line versus the Missouri offensive line to get after the quarterback. I saw that firsthand.
Yeah.
In Knoxville a few weeks ago. I think Tennessee finds a way to pull this one out. And then we're talking about, the next SEC, the biggest game left on the schedule. It was LSU, Bama. Now it's Ole Miss, Georgia. I think it's going to ultimately be Tennessee and Georgia. after that. So we'll see. I do still, no matter what, I do think we're seeing a collision course of Bama and Georgia again in Atlanta, with that one being pretty interesting because both these teams are down from what they've been the last 5 years, but they're still two of the five best in college football.
Hypothetical scenario for you. And first and foremost, when we're going into an SEC where things feel crazy and a college football season where everything is weird and Georgia and Alabama still ending up in the SEC championship game is just annoying.
I know, right?
But let's say a hypothetical situation, also very likely scenario. Alabama and Georgia in the SEC championship game. Alabama beats Georgia.
Yeah.
Does Alabama get in over Georgia? Like, does Georgia get overlooked?
I think Alabama.
If you're looking at a one-loss Oregon Pac-12 champion, potentially an undefeated Ohio State or Michigan, potentially an undefeated Florida State.
I think if it's an undefeated Florida State, an undefeated Washington, and an undefeated Big Ten champ, then I think that if all three of those are what we're talking about, I think Bama would get in over Georgia. I think they win the SEC. They'd have identical records. They'd have won the head-to-head. I think Bama gets in. The question, Caroline, that really begs answering is if all that happens and that fourth spot is a one-loss SEC champ Alabama with some real wins, beating Ole Miss, beating LSU, beating Georgia, which they'd have to do, beating Tennessee if the Vols keep winning, versus a one-loss Texas team that will not play Oklahoma, it would appear in the Big 12 title game, that will virtually have beaten no one of note, maybe Oklahoma if the Sooners can avoid a third embarrassing loss, but they would have beaten Bama on the road in Tuscaloosa. Who goes in that instance? If you've got Alabama doing this, Texas kind of doing this, but just finding ways to win against bad teams, but they won the head-to-head, but it was a head-to-head in week 2, and you know how the committees can be. That one would be fascinating. I think a more likely scenario when all this shakes out, Caroline, could be a one-loss Texas team that beat Bama versus a one-loss Oregon team that beat Washington. And that Washington win, if Bama loses to Georgia in the SEC title game, might be a more impressive victory than Texas beating Bama. If you're really getting real and you take the names out of it, because UW could be ranked, at the end of the season, if they only lose to Oregon, they're going to be a higher ranked team than Bama. So a one-loss Pac-12 champ Oregon versus a one-loss Big 12 champ Texas. And I know everyone around here will go, Texas gets it because they always get the breaks.
I would take Oregon.
I think I would too.
I think Oregon is probably the most complete team in the country. And you can make an argument for Georgia. You can make an argument for Michigan. We'll see how Michigan looks life without Connor Stallions against Penn State this weekend.
Yep.
But Oregon looks like a team. Like if you put Oregon in the SEC right now,
yeah,
they might be the second or third best team in the SEC behind a Georgia or an Alabama.
I think they're no worse than third, right? I think they're no worse
than third.
Yep.
And so I think a Texas team with a backup quarterback, if they're able to, win out the rest of the season and win the Big 12, there's a very fair argument. But if Texas and Oregon play on a neutral field right now, I would set the spread at 13.5 in favor of Oregon. So I don't know how I can put Texas in over Oregon in that scenario.
Here's Texas's remaining schedule, whereas Oregon
kind of rinky-dink, isn't it?
Whereas Oregon would have to play Washington, right? Like if Washington wins out, you're talking about
the Pac-12 championship
top
game.
3 Oregon team, top 4 at worst. Texas would play a bad TCU team that's sitting at or under 500 this weekend. They would go play a bad Iowa State team, and then they would play an Oklahoma State team, Caroline, that lost. Let me check this to make sure I'm accurate with it. That lost to.
Do they play Oklahoma State?
No. If if Oklahoma State keeps winning, they'll be in the Big 12 title game with
in the
Texas.
Big 12 title game.
So they would go TCU, Iowa State, and a really bad, not a really bad, but Oklahoma State team that at the end of the day, Oak State lost to South Alabama. Okay? And that's the toughest team left on their schedule, whereas, Oregon would have to go through Washington. So there would be, I think, some recency bias there. So it really interesting around the country the way this thing shakes out. You look for the ones that could screw it up this weekend. K-State was in that role last week against Texas. I think this week one of the ones to circle and watch in terms of that. USC was in that position last week against Washington. Both ones failed.
Michigan could be in that position this weekend.
Exactly. Michigan, Penn State, Ole Miss, Georgia. Those are really the two that stand out that could really shake things up. I think the Michigan-Penn State one is one I would watch the most closely, considering Michigan really hasn't been tested. They really haven't played anybody yet. And guess what? We know what's going on circling over there with Jim Harbaugh. No matter what you say, that's got to be a distraction on some level.
Florida State's another one. They host Miami this weekend. And Florida State is a team that I don't think can afford a single loss. I think Florida State has to run the table and win the ACC title game to still be in contention, because I don't think the ACC is good enough to support a one-loss team getting into the Final Four. So that could be an interesting game, Miami, Florida State this weekend.
Only because it's a rivalry. And I'm sitting here saying this, and I watched Miami beat A&M by 2 touchdowns, but that's one we don't talk about with A&M, and that was a bad loss when you look at it now. At the time, you're going, Van Dyke, and, Cristobal got 2 new coordinators in Miami. No, they're not good. But it's a rivalry, and they have talent, and they got a veteran QB, so who knows?
And it is in Tallahassee, so
I was worried about Florida State going to Pitt last weekend. That was one that to me was a danger zone type of game. Pitt and Narduzzi, and they just kind of have a way of doing that there, and it's East Coast, and it's just...
They're not very good, but they always find a way to give good teams fits.
Yeah, it's so true.
It's like App State.
Oh, don't say that. Hey, would you?
Sorry,
really?
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that.
Too soon. Soon.
It will always be too soon. 10 years from now, it'll be too soon. Just like when anybody
LSU
brings up the existence of Troy.
Yeah, but you came back and won a national title, so that's okay. A&M hasn't done that.
Well, we came back 2 years later and won a national title, so maybe we're all holding out for 2024 Texas A&M.
Right.
Going on a 2019 LSU-esque run.
Let's do it. Caroline, we'll do it again next week. Appreciate you as always.
We'll do it again next week. Full breakdown of the Week 10 slate and looking ahead to Week 11. For Liucci, I'm Caroline Fenton. This is Up to the Second.
All right, everybody. Thanks so much for watching Up to the Second College Football, and thanks to our presenting sponsor, Academy Sports and Outdoors. We'll see you next week.